Jack blinked, taking a slow sip of his coffee as he stared at Barbara. He couldn't quite figure out what kind of request she had in mind this time. It wasn't unusual for her to demand something, but this felt different. Barbara marched right up to him, not bothering to step around the chickens that had begun to peck at the gravel. "We're hosting the annual community event, and we need your farm's produce," she said without any introduction. Her voice was firm, as though it was a given that Jack would agree. "And not just any produce. We want it for free." Jack's eyebrows raised slightly as he tried to process the words. Free? She wasn't suggesting a discount or a donation. She was demanding free food, and for an event that he hadn't even been consulted about. "Barbara, I'm not sure I understand," Jack said, setting down his coffee mug, keeping his voice calm but skeptical. "Are you asking for a donation? Or are you just expecting me to give away my produce for nothing?" Barbara didn't flinch. "It's not a donation," she replied sharply. "It's a requirement for the community. We need you to step up and contribute, Jack. This event needs your farm's best. Tomatoes, cucumbers, everything you've got." She paused for a moment, eyes narrowing, like she was waiting for Jack to fall in line. Jack chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm afraid I can't just give away my crops. Maybe we can work something out. Discuss a fair price for the produce you want." Barbara's lips tightened, and her posture stiffened even more. "No, Jack, we're not discussing a price. This is about community spirit. It's about being part of something bigger." She took a step closer, as if her proximity might change his mind. "You wouldn't want to be the one to ruin this event for everyone, would you?" Jack stood his ground, feeling the weight of her words but refusing to back down. His farm wasn't just a business. It was his life. The idea of giving away his hard-earned crops for free was laughable. And yet, there she was, demanding it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I'll pass," Jack said, his voice steady. "I've worked hard to grow this farm, Barbara. I'm not giving away my livelihood for nothing." Barbara reached the porch, her heels digging into the gravel with every step. She paused for a moment, glaring at the chicken that had wandered too close to her shoes. "Move, you little feather duster," she muttered under her breath, swiping at the bird in a dramatic fashion. Jack could barely hold back a chuckle as she maneuvered around it, smoothing down the fabric of her skirt, a look of pure irritation on her face. The morning had taken an unexpected turn, but Jack wasn't sure whether to be amused or concerned about what Barbara wanted. "Well, good morning to you too, Barbara," Jack said calmly, setting his coffee mug down on the wooden railing. He adjusted the cap on his head and leaned back against the porch. The humor in his voice was clear, but the suspicion in his eyes was hard to hide. Barbara didn't respond with her usual pleasantries. Instead, she straightened up, her eyes narrowing as she pointed a perfectly manicured finger at his chest. "Jack Bennett," she began, her voice rising in volume. "This community needs your cooperation, and it needs it now." Jack raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms over his chest. His interest was piqued, but he wasn't about to give her any satisfaction just yet. "Cooperation for what exactly?" he asked, his tone easy but filled with skepticism. Barbara's lips pressed into a thin line as she took a deep breath, collecting her words. "There's a community event coming up, and we insist, that you contribute some of your farm's produce for free." Jack blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the audacity of her request. "Wait a second," he said, a small smirk playing on his face. "Free food for a community event? Barbara, I'm all for supporting the neighborhood, but I don't run a charity here." Barbara's eyes flashed with annoyance, but she didn't back down. "It's not a suggestion, Jack. This is about community spirit. You're a part of this community whether you like it or not. We need your help, and you're going to provide it." She took a step closer, her heels clicking loudly against the wooden boards of the porch. Jack's smile faded just a bit, but his voice remained calm. "Barbara, you know as well as I do that I can't afford to just give away my crops. This farm is my livelihood. We're talking about months of hard work and care, not just a freebie for an event." Maybe we could discuss a fair discount for the festival, but free. Barbara shook her head, a sharp edge creeping into her voice. That's where you're wrong, Jack. You will provide. This isn't a discussion. She paused, her face hardening. Do you really want to test me on this? Jack took a slow sip of his coffee, staring at her for a moment as if weighing the situation. There was no panic in his eyes. Test you? Over tomatoes and cucumbers? He asked, the words dripping with casual sarcasm. Barbara leaned in, narrowing her eyes. You seem to forget that I'm the president of the HOA. I can make things difficult for you. There's a lot I can do when it comes to maintaining the community's reputation. She smirked, stepping back, as if she had made her point. Jack's pulse quickened slightly, but he kept his face calm. He'd dealt with tough situations before, and this wasn't going to be any different. Last I checked, my farm isn't part of your HOA, he said, his voice steady but firm. Barbara faltered for a second, but quickly recovered. Technicalities, she dismissed, waving her hand in the air. You're close enough. The neighborhood loves a good community event. What do you think will happen if rumors start circulating that your farm isn't safe or sanitary? Jack's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening slightly. He didn't like where this was heading. The smile on Barbara's face was sweet, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile that masked something darker. Are you threatening me, Barbara? He asked, his voice low, his eyes locked on hers. Over a couple of vegetables? Barbara's expression hardened, but she didn't back down. I'm suggesting cooperation, she said sweetly. If you don't, well, there will be consequences. Jack stared at her, his hands resting on the porch railing. He didn't flinch, despite the unease that churned in his stomach. Well, let me save you the trouble, Barbara, he said, his voice even. My answer is still no. I'm sure your event will manage just fine without my carrots and cabbage. Barbara's face turned red with anger. She hadn't expected defiance, and it clearly threw her off balance. Her jaw clenched, but before she could speak, the chicken, seemingly sensing the drama, let out a loud squawk, drawing Barbara's attention. She stumbled back in surprise, almost losing her footing in her expensive heels. Jack couldn't help himself. He chuckled loudly, enjoying the sight of her discomfort. Barbara's face flushed a bright crimson. You'll regret this, Jack Bennett, she hissed through gritted teeth. She quickly turned and stormed back toward her car, feathers sticking to her designer outfit. You'll see. As her car sped off, nearly clipping the mailbox, Jack leaned back, exhaling deeply. He'd won this round, but a nagging feeling lingered in his gut. Barbara might be ridiculous, but she wasn't harmless. Jack had been around long enough to know that people like her didn't give up easily. Despite the tension in the air, Jack found himself chuckling again. His farm was his peace, his hard-earned sanctuary. He wasn't about to let anyone, especially Barbara Coleman, ruin it. But as he watched her car disappear down the road, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was only just the beginning. As the days passed, Jack's peaceful routine was increasingly interrupted by whispers and gossip around the neighborhood. It wasn't long before he noticed the change in the air, a subtle tension that seemed to follow him everywhere. At first, he brushed it off, thinking it was just another passing storm. But it soon became clear that something much worse was brewing. One afternoon, as Jack walked past the general store, he overheard a conversation between two of his neighbors. Did you hear about Jack's farm? One of them asked, lowering their voice as if the very mention of his name could spread illness. They say his vegetables are unsafe. They've got chemicals in them, maybe even pesticides. The other neighbor nodded, a look of concern on their face. I heard his tomatoes are radioactive. And don't even get me started on his cucumbers. Jack's stomach twisted. He stood frozen for a moment, stunned by the absurdity of the claims. Radioactive? He had spent years cultivating the land with nothing but care and respect for the soil. The thought that anyone could believe such lies made his blood run cold. As he walked home, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind these rumors. Later that evening, as Jack sat on his porch with a glass of iced tea, His granddaughter Emily came rushing up the driveway, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "Grandpa, have you seen the community Facebook page?" she asked, her voice a mixture of worry and disbelief. "There's all this stuff about your farm. People are saying it's a health hazard." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had never paid much attention to social media, but now it seemed impossible to avoid. Emily showed him the posts, and Jack's heart sank as he scrolled through the comments. Barbara had gone to work, painting his farm as some sort of toxic wasteland. "It's so bad," Emily added. "People are saying your carrots can cause nightmares and that your lettuce makes people turn green." "Green, huh?" Jack said with a dry laugh, trying to hide his frustration. "Well, that's new. I didn't know I was growing mutant vegetables." But his smile faded quickly as the reality of the situation hit him. This wasn't just some small-town gossip, it was a full-on attack. And it had the potential to ruin everything he had worked for. Jack felt a knot tighten in his chest. How far was Barbara willing to go? That night, as Jack lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. He had always prided himself on keeping a low profile, sticking to his land and his work. But Barbara had crossed a line, and now it seemed like there was no way out. He had to act, but what could he do against someone with so much influence? The next morning, just as Jack was starting his day, the doorbell rang. He opened it to find Sarah, Barbara's assistant, standing on his porch. She looked nervous, her eyes darting around as if she was worried someone might see her. "Jack," she said, her voice low, "I need to talk to you. It's important." He stepped aside to let her in, offering her a seat at the kitchen table. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone wary. Sarah hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Barbara's not finished with you. She's planning to go after your farm with legal action. She's already drafting some papers to force your closure over zoning violations. She's even planning to get the city involved. You need to be prepared." Jack felt his blood run cold. Zoning violations? Over what? Anything she can find. She's already looking into ways to twist the rules to her advantage. And this isn't the first time she's done something like this. She's been using her position to manipulate the system for years, Sarah explained, her voice shaking slightly. "I didn't want to be a part of it anymore. That's why I'm telling you this." Jack took a deep breath, his mind racing. This was worse than he thought. Barbara wasn't just trying to ruin his reputation. She was willing to destroy his livelihood. But he wasn't about to let that happen. He had worked too hard for too long to just give up now. "Thanks for the heads up, Sarah," Jack said, his voice steady. "I won't let her get away with it." Sarah gave him a small, grateful smile before standing up. "I'll help you however I can," she said, before heading for the door. As Jack stood in his kitchen, a sense of determination washed over him. He wasn't just going to sit back and let Barbara win. He would fight back not just for himself, but for his farm and the community that depended on it. He had spent years building this place, and he wasn't going to let some entitled HOA president take it all away. Later that day, Ted stopped by, as he often did, to check on Jack. As they sat on the porch, sipping cold beers, Ted raised an eyebrow at the tension in the air. "Something's off, Jack. You look like you've been stewing over something," Ted said, his voice light but concerned. Jack let out a chuckle, leaning back in his chair. "Barbara's gone and started a full-on war, Ted. She's spreading lies about my farm online, claiming my vegetables are poisonous." Ted's eyes widened, and he shook his head. "She's always been a pain, but this is ridiculous." "I know," Jack replied, shaking his head, "but I'm not going to let her get away with it. I'm thinking it's time we fight back. Show her I'm not the easy target she thinks I am." Ted laughed, raising his bottle. "Well, if you need help, you know where to find me. I got your back, Jack. Let's show Barbara she picked the wrong farm to mess with." Jack's resolve solidified. This wasn't just about vegetables anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who thought she could control everything. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The envelope arrived a few days later, its weight far more than just paper. Jack had a feeling the moment he saw the return address. Barbara Coleman had officially escalated the situation. He carefully tore open the envelope, unfolding the letter inside. It was full of legal jargon, warnings about zoning violations, health inspection failures, and the dreaded threat of fines. The letter claimed his farm was in breach of local regulations, accusing him of running an unsafe operation. Barbara had even included a few choice words about the public safety risk his farm posed. Jack couldn't help but chuckle as he read through it, shaking his head. It was typical of Barbara to overdo things, but this time, it seemed she was really pulling out all the stops. He leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee, and let the absurdity of it all sink in. "Oh, this is rich," Jack muttered, flipping through the pages again, scanning for anything of substance. "She really thinks a couple of tomatoes are going to take down my farm?" His tone was laced with sarcasm as he tossed the letter on the table, unfazed by her threats. He picked up his phone and sent a quick message to his lawyer. He wasn't about to let Barbara run over him with these baseless claims. If she wanted a fight, she was going to get one. But as far as he was concerned, this letter was nothing more than a bad joke. Just as he was about to put the issue aside for the moment, his phone buzzed. Emily, his granddaughter, had messaged him with a link to something online. With a sigh, he opened the notification. It was a post on the local Facebook group. His heart sank as he scrolled through the comments, each one worse than the last. Barbara had clearly taken her campaign online, painting his farm as a dangerous, toxic environment. According to her, Jack's produce wasn't just unfit for human consumption, it was practically radioactive. Someone had even commented that eating his cucumbers would give you nightmares. Another person claimed his carrots could turn your skin green. The list of bizarre accusations went on, each one more ludicrous than the last. Jack stared at the screen, rubbing his forehead in disbelief. Radioactive? Seriously? He leaned back in his chair, chuckling despite himself. "Well, I always did wonder why my tomatoes looked so bright." His amusement was short-lived, though. As he read further, he saw that some of his neighbors were starting to ask questions. One post read, "Has anyone actually seen Jack's farm? I'm hearing strange things." Another comment suggested that maybe it was time for an inspection of the property. Jack knew this wasn't just some idle gossip anymore. It was starting to gain traction. The next morning, as Jack sat on the porch, trying to shake off the weight of the situation, Ted pulled up in his usual beat-up truck, a grin on his face. "What's this I hear about radioactive carrots, Jack? You're gonna start selling them as a health miracle next?" Jack looked up from his coffee, forcing a smile. "Apparently, my vegetables are the new superfoods, full of radiation and potential nightmares." "Who knew?" Ted laughed, but then his face turned serious. "That's not good, Jack. People are starting to talk. Some are even asking if there's any truth to those claims. You might want to do something before this spirals." Jack stared at the screen of his phone, the comments still rolling in. "I know, Ted. I've got to figure out how to deal with this. Barbara's not just going after my farm. She's messing with my reputation." Ted scratched his chin, deep in thought. "You've got any proof of Barbara's past shenanigans? People around here know she's been up to something. You could use that." Jack's eyes lit up. Sarah's warning came rushing back to him. She had given him the documents, proof of Barbara's questionable use of HOA funds. Maybe it was time to turn the tables. "Actually, I do have something," Jack said, his tone changing. He was already thinking about how to use this new ammunition. "Let's dig into Barbara's past. I've got the paperwork Sarah gave me. We can show people what she's really been doing behind the scenes." Ted's eyes widened. "You mean you've got dirt on her? Well, now we're talking." Jack smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Let's see if we can find a few more skeletons in her closet. Maybe it's time she stopped hiding behind lies and threats." The two of them got to work, pulling out Sarah's folder and going through it together. Jack wasn't exactly tech-savvy, so Ted's grandson, Ethan, came by to lend a hand. Ethan was a whiz with computers and quickly got them into the HOA's online records. It didn't take long before they found something interesting, expenses that clearly weren't legitimate. Spa visits, lavish dinners, and even a luxury shopping spree, all supposedly paid for with HOA funds. The more they looked, the worse it got. Barbara had been using the community's money to fund her own lifestyle. "This is unbelievable," Ted muttered, shaking his head. "She's been using this position like a personal piggy bank. No wonder she's so confident." Jack felt a mixture of anger and satisfaction. This wasn't just petty revenge anymore. This was about justice, about showing people the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. With the evidence in hand, Jack knew what he had to do next. "Let's get this out there," Jack said, his voice steady. "Time to expose Barbara for what she really is." Ted nodded, looking at Jack with a new level of respect. "You've got my full support. Let's make sure people know who they're dealing with." With the documents in hand and the community's trust hanging by a thread, Jack wasn't going to back down. He had a farm to protect, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make sure Barbara's lies didn't destroy it. The battle was just beginning. The community meeting was held at the old clubhouse, a building that had seen better days, but still managed to serve as the hub of neighborhood events. Jack had heard about it for days now, the buzz surrounding the event, and Barbara's insistence on turning it into something larger than life. He knew this was coming, the confrontation, the inevitable showdown between him and the HOA president. He didn't expect it to go smoothly, but nothing had prepared him for the spectacle that was about to unfold. As Jack entered the room, it was packed. Neighbors, many of whom he had known for years, whispered among themselves, casting sidelong glances his way. There was a noticeable tension in the air, a crackling energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Barbara was already standing at the front of the room, her oversized sunglasses perched firmly on her nose, her stance commanding as always. She looked like she was about to deliver a speech to a crowd of adoring fans, not a room full of people who were slowly starting to see through her. "Thank you, everyone, for joining today," Barbara began, her voice carrying through the room, full of that forced authority she loved so much. "We're gathered here because some of us have not been contributing to the greater good of our community. Some of us have refused to support the upcoming festival, which is not just a celebration, but a vital event for our town." Her eyes immediately locked onto Jack, and she didn't waste time. "Jack Bennett, I'm talking about you. You've refused to cooperate with the festival, despite being asked nicely, and now your actions have consequences." The room went silent, all eyes turning to Jack, who stood near the back, calm and collected. His heart rate remained steady, his expression unchanged. This was exactly what he expected. He could already feel the whispers picking up again, the eyes scanning him for signs of weakness. Jack stood up straight, raising a hand to get the room's attention. "I'm sorry, Barbara," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "But I didn't realize that refusing to give away free food made me some sort of enemy of the community." Barbara's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flashing with anger. "It's not just about the food, Jack," she shot back, her voice rising. "It's about being a part of this neighborhood. This community needs you, and you refuse to cooperate. You've put yourself above everyone else." Jack took a step forward, his gaze steady as he met her challenge. "Is that what this is about? You're upset because I won't just hand over my crops for free?" He paused, letting the weight of the question hang in the air. "Tell me, Barbara, what exactly is the community getting in return for this cooperation you keep talking about?" Barbara's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Jack held up the envelope from earlier, the one she had sent him with all the legal threats. "I'm talking about this," he said. "You know, all these accusations about my farm being unsafe. Funny thing, I thought it was just a few vegetables, but you're really trying to turn it into something else. And then, I find out you've been using the HOA's money for, well, let's just say some very questionable expenses." The room went quiet, the murmurs beginning again, only now they were directed at Barbara. Jack continued, his voice even but cutting. "I think the community deserves to know where their fees are going. I mean, spa weekends, designer shoes, luxury dinners. And what's this about a private consultant? All paid for with the HOA's money." Barbara's face went pale, her jaw tightening as she tried to maintain control. "That's preposterous," she spat. Those are baseless accusations, Jack. You have no proof. Oh, I've got proof, Jack said with a small, knowing smile. All thanks to someone who didn't want to see the community taken advantage of. He turned briefly to Sarah, sitting quietly at the back of the room, her eyes wide as she watched the exchange. But don't worry, Barbara. We can look at the numbers together. Everyone here deserves to see exactly where their hard-earned money has gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Barbara's carefully constructed facade was starting to crack, the icy exterior giving way to something else, something much less composed. Her face flushed a deep red, her hands trembling as she clenched them at her sides. Lies, she hissed, trying to regain her composure. All lies. You think you can just slander me like this and get away with it? You'll regret this, Jack Bennett. But it was too late. The room was no longer on her side. The neighbors who had been hesitant to speak out were now murmuring among themselves, questioning her motives. Jack had turned the tables, and Barbara's attempt to bully him into submission had backfired spectacularly. Without warning, Barbara snapped. Her calm, self-assured persona shattered entirely, and she stormed toward the door, her heels clicking loudly against the wooden floor. "This isn't over," she shouted, her voice trembling with fury. "You'll pay for this, Jack. You'll regret ever challenging me." Jack stood there, watching her go, his arms crossed as the room collectively exhaled. Barbara's outburst was both predictable and ridiculous. She had lost control, and it was clear to everyone who was watching who the real villain was in this situation. As Barbara nearly tripped over the entrance mat, Jack couldn't help himself. "Maybe next time, Barbara, try not to trip over your own ego," he said loud enough for the room to hear. A few people chuckled, and Jack's smile grew wider, his heart lighter now that the tension had finally broken. Barbara spun around, her face a deep crimson. But before she could say anything else, she turned and stormed out of the room, her dramatic exit only making her look more foolish. Jack couldn't help but shake his head as he turned back to the remaining neighbors, his calm demeanor restoring a sense of peace to the room. "Don't worry, folks," he said, his voice steady. "We'll get this all straightened out. But we're not going to be bullied. Not by anyone." The crowd began to stir, and Jack could sense the shift in the room. What had started as a tense meeting now felt like a turning point. Barbara's attempt to rally the community had backfired, and the support Jack had feared losing was slowly returning. Jack had won this round, but he knew the battle wasn't over. But for now, he felt a sense of victory, small but important. And at that moment, it was all he needed. The following afternoon, as Jack was out in the field, working on the crops he had painstakingly planted, he saw a car pull up along the dirt road. He didn't recognize the vehicle at first, but as it got closer, the familiar face of Tom Coleman emerged. Jack's heart skipped a beat. Tom was Barbara's son, the one person in the neighborhood who had always kept his distance from the drama, trying to stay neutral. It was rare for him to show up on Jack's property. Tom stepped out of the car, looking more nervous than Jack had ever seen him. His eyes darted around, almost as if he was making sure no one was watching. He walked toward Jack, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Hey, Jack," Tom greeted, his voice quieter than usual. "Can we talk for a minute?" Jack raised an eyebrow. This was unusual. Tom had never come by for anything personal, and now he was here, looking like he was about to spill something important. "Sure, Tom. What's going on?" Jack said, wiping his hands on his jeans and stepping closer. Tom hesitated for a moment, glancing nervously around the farm. "I don't know how to say this, but I overheard something. Something about what Barbara is planning next." Jack felt his stomach tighten. He had suspected that Barbara wasn't finished, but hearing it from Tom confirmed his worst fears. "What exactly did you hear?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Tom let out a sigh, his shoulders slumping slightly. "She's pushing forward with more legal threats, Jack. She's not letting this go. I overheard her talking about trying to get zoning officials involved, making claims about your farm's operation. She's desperate to get you shut down." Jack's mind raced. He'd already suspected that Barbara wasn't going to back down, but hearing it from Tom gave the situation a much more dangerous feel. So, she's not finished with these bogus accusations? Jack muttered under his breath, running a hand through his hair. Tom shook his head. No, and it's not just the zoning stuff. She's planning to go after you legally. She's trying to find anything, any way to hurt your business. She won't stop until she gets what she wants. Jack looked at Tom, considering what he had just learned. Tom was clearly conflicted, and it wasn't hard to see that he didn't agree with his mother's tactics. Why are you telling me this, Tom? Jack asked. If you're worried about what she's doing, why not tell someone else? Tom shifted uncomfortably. Because I can't just sit by and watch her ruin you, Jack. You've been nothing but decent to me, to all of us. And it's wrong what she's doing. I don't like it, and I can't keep quiet anymore. Jack studied Tom for a moment. He had never expected someone like him to come forward, especially given his mother's hold over the neighborhood. Tom had always kept his distance from the drama, choosing to remain neutral. But now, it seemed like his conscience had gotten the better of him. Thanks, Tom, Jack said, his voice softer than before. You didn't have to do this, but I appreciate it. Tom gave a small nod. Just be careful, okay? I'm not sure how far she'll go, but I know she's determined. As Tom turned to leave, Jack's mind was already working through his options. He wasn't just fighting rumors anymore. He was fighting something much bigger. Barbara was pulling out all the stops to destroy him, and it was clear now that her plans weren't just petty. She was trying to break him for good. Later that afternoon, Ted came by for his usual visit. He could tell something was off the moment he stepped out of his truck. Jack didn't greet him with his usual smile, and there was a tense air about him. What's going on, Jack? You look like you've seen a ghost, Ted remarked, looking around. Jack motioned for him to sit. It's worse than I thought, Ted. I just had a conversation with Tom Coleman. Turns out, Barbara isn't just spreading lies and rumors anymore. She's going after my farm with legal threats, trying to shut me down completely. And I'm not sure how far she's willing to go. Ted's expression turned serious, his usual light-hearted demeanor vanishing. I knew that woman wasn't going to stop. You've got a fight on your hands, Jack. But don't worry, I've got your back. Jack looked at Ted, feeling a surge of gratitude. Ted had always been there for him, no matter the situation. It was good to know that, even now, when things were getting harder, his best friend wasn't going anywhere. I'm glad to hear that, Ted, Jack said with a small smile. But this is different. I thought I could handle her, but now it's gotten serious. She's using her influence to ruin everything I've worked for. Ted nodded, his face grim. We'll handle it, Jack. We've always fought the tough fights together. You've got the community behind you, even if they're a little afraid to speak up. And we've got something she doesn't. Humor and the truth. You know, the kind of stuff she can't fight. Jack chuckled despite himself. Yeah, I guess we do. But this time, we need more than just jokes. We need a plan. Ted leaned back in his chair, his mind already working. I think it's time we take this to the next level. If Barbara wants a fight, let's give her one. But this time, we use everything we've got. Legal, social media, and all the people who've been quietly backing you up. Jack's confidence grew with Ted's words. For the first time in a while, he didn't feel so alone in this battle. He had more than just his farm to protect now. He had his reputation, his dignity, and his community. And with Ted by his side, he felt like they could take on whatever Barbara threw at them. We'll make her regret ever messing with us, Jack said, determination setting in. This fight is far from over, but we're not going down without a fight. Ted raised his glass in a silent toast. Jack followed suit, the weight of the situation still pressing on him. But for the first time in days, he felt a spark of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight. Not anymore. The day of the community festival arrived, and the air was thick with excitement and nervous energy. Jack had been preparing for weeks, gathering his best produce, carefully harvesting the ripest tomatoes, cucumbers, and a variety of fresh vegetables. Despite the chaos Barbara had stirred up with her false claims, Jack knew he couldn't back down. He had worked too hard to let her take away what he had built. So, He loaded his truck with crates of vegetables and made his way to the festival grounds. As Jack pulled up, he could see the makeshift tables being set up and volunteers scrambling to organize the event. The decorations were haphazardly thrown together, and the whole place had a last-minute feel to it. Jack couldn't help but shake his head at the disorganized chaos. It wasn't surprising, this was Barbara's event after all. She had been too busy scheming to actually put in the work. When he stepped out of the truck, a few neighbors greeted him warmly. They seemed relieved to see him there, and some even complimented the fresh vegetables he had brought. Jack's heart lifted as he unloaded the crates, setting them up neatly on the table. The contrast between his vibrant, freshly picked produce and the wilted, haphazard vegetables that Barbara had managed to gather was immediately obvious. As Jack finished setting up, he noticed Barbara hovering nearby, watching with narrowed eyes. She stood across from the table, arms crossed, her expression one of obvious disdain. She had her sunglasses on, as usual, and a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was clear she wasn't happy to see Jack's produce getting so much attention. Trying to keep up appearances, Barbara finally walked over, feigning interest. "Well, Jack," she said with an exaggerated sigh, "I see you've brought your usual, fresh produce. How charming." She eyed the tomatoes and cucumbers with a critical gaze, her lips curling slightly. "I suppose they look all right, but I'm sure there are plenty of other places in the neighborhood with better options." Jack raised an eyebrow, unable to help himself. "Better options, huh? Well, Barbara, I've got to admit, I'd love to hear about them. After all, those wilted greens you brought don't exactly scream fresh to me." Barbara huffed, clearly annoyed by the light-hearted jab, but she wasn't ready to back down. "You'll see," she said with a forced smile. "Once people taste the food from other vendors, I'm sure they'll forget all about these simple vegetables of yours." But as the day wore on, something unexpected happened. The more people sampled Jack's produce, the more they praised it. "These tomatoes are perfect," one neighbor said, taking a bite of a juicy red tomato. "So sweet and fresh, just like I remember from my grandmother's garden." Jack couldn't help but smile as the compliments rolled in. His farm had always been about quality, and now it seemed like everyone was starting to notice. Barbara, on the other hand, was growing visibly uncomfortable. She had been watching from the sidelines, trying to maintain her composed demeanor, but it was clear her confidence was slipping. People were starting to gather around Jack's table, laughing, chatting, and enjoying the fresh produce he had brought. The crowd was much bigger than Barbara had expected, and her attempts to undermine Jack were falling flat. In a last-ditch effort to save face, Barbara stepped forward, picking up a tomato from Jack's table. "Well, if you're all so sure these are so good," she said, her voice slightly shaking, "I guess I'll have to try one myself." The crowd went quiet as Barbara took a dramatic bite of the tomato, her eyes widening as the sweet, juicy flavor hit her taste buds. She chewed slowly, her face a mask of forced indifference, but it was clear the taste had caught her off guard. After a moment, her lips twitched in spite of herself, and for just a second, it looked like she was about to admit that Jack's vegetables were, in fact, as good as everyone was saying. "Well," she said quickly, trying to cover up the brief moment of genuine enjoyment, "it's not bad, but I'm sure there are still better options around here." Just as Barbara turned to walk away, something strange happened. She stopped suddenly, her face going pale. She took a few unsteady steps backward, her hand clutching her chest dramatically. "Oh no!" she gasped, her voice rising in panic. I think I'm feeling sick." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Barbara staggered, her hand still over her heart. She dropped to her knees, letting out a loud gasp. "I knew it," she moaned dramatically. "Jack's produce, it's poisoned me." Jack's jaw dropped in disbelief. Was she really doing this? Had she sunk so low that she was now pretending his vegetables had made her sick? The paramedics, who had been standing by for the event, rushed over, but they didn't seem to be in any hurry to attend to her. One of the paramedics crouched down beside Barbara, checking her vitals. After a moment, he stood up, a confused look on his face. "Ma'am," he said, speaking loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "There's nothing wrong with you. In fact, you seem perfectly fine." Barbara's face turned crimson as she tried to sit up, but the damage had been done. The crowd began to murmur, and a few people laughed under their breath. Barbara had been exposed for what she was, an overdramatic manipulator who would stop at nothing to get her way. Jack stood there, a slight smile tugging at his lips. He had known all along that Barbara's theatrics would eventually catch up with her. And now, in front of the entire community, her desperate attempt to discredit him had backfired spectacularly. As Barbara stood, her face flushed with humiliation, she muttered something about needing to rest and hurriedly made her way to her car. She didn't even look back as she left, her grand exit spoiled by her own theatrics. The crowd erupted into laughter and applause, not just for Jack's success, but for Barbara's spectacular collapse. For the first time in weeks, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had stood his ground, and the community had seen through Barbara's lies. Today, the farm and the truth had won. The next morning, Jack stood in his kitchen, sipping his coffee, trying to shake off the events of the previous day. The laughter and excitement from the festival still echoed in his mind. But as the sun rose over the farm, a small part of him felt uneasy. He had won, no doubt, but the whole situation with Barbara had left its mark. She had tried to ruin him, and yet here he was, still standing. But now there was something else on his mind. The sound of a car pulling up interrupted his thoughts. Looking out the window, Jack saw Barbara's car rolling down the driveway. His first instinct was to ignore her, but as she stepped out of the vehicle, he could tell something was different. She was no longer the confident, demanding woman who had stormed onto his property days earlier. Her shoulders were slumped, and she walked slowly, almost hesitantly. Jack sighed and put his mug down, making his way to the porch. "What is it now, Barbara?" he asked, though his tone was softer than before. Barbara paused in front of him, her eyes avoiding his for a moment. For the first time, Jack saw genuine regret in her expression. "Jack," she began, her voice quieter than usual, "I owe you an apology. Everything I've done, all the lies, I never should have treated you the way I did. I've been so focused on getting my way that I lost sight of what really mattered." Jack raised an eyebrow but stayed silent, letting her speak. "I was wrong," Barbara continued, her voice shaking slightly. "I've hurt you, and I've hurt this whole community. I've been selfish and, well, I'm sorry." Jack stood there for a moment, letting her words sink in. He had expected another round of excuses, another attempt at manipulation. But this was different. He could hear the sincerity in her voice, and for the first time, he wondered if Barbara had finally realized what she had done. "I appreciate the apology, Barbara," Jack said finally, his voice calm. "But words aren't enough. You've got to show this community, show yourself that you've learned from this. You've got to make things right." Barbara nodded, her face softening as she looked up at him. "I will. Promise. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Jack gave her a small nod, his expression serious but not harsh. "That's all I ask." As Barbara walked back to her car, Jack watched her go, the weight of the situation beginning to lift from his shoulders. He had never been one to hold grudges, but there was a certain satisfaction in seeing someone own up to their mistakes. It wasn't easy, especially for someone like Barbara, but maybe this was the start of something better. Later that day, as Jack went about his usual work on the farm, he couldn't help but notice a shift in the neighborhood. Neighbors he hadn't heard from in weeks or months began stopping by, some to congratulate him, others to simply chat. Word had spread about how Jack had handled everything with grace, how he had stayed calm even when things got ugly. People who had been too scared to speak up before were now coming forward, offering support. Ted stopped by that afternoon, a grin on his face. "You know, Jack, you've become the talk of the town," he said with a chuckle. "You handled Barbara better than I ever could have. I think the whole neighborhood's behind you now." Jack smiled, feeling a sense of pride settle over him. "Maybe, but it's not just me. It's the community. They saw what happened. They know the truth. And it was true." The people around him had started to realize what had been going on. They saw the strength in Jack, the way he had stood up for what was right, without giving in to anger or fear. He hadn't just won the battle against Barbara. He had earned the respect of the people around him. As Jack sat down that evening, looking out at his farm, he felt a deep sense of peace. The whole ordeal had taught him something he hadn't expected. He had always believed that kindness and honesty were the best way to approach life. But now he knew for sure. Even in the face of adversity, staying true to himself had been the right choice. The farm, once just a place of work, now felt more like home than ever. The community had rallied behind him, and his reputation was stronger than it had ever been. Business was booming, and people were coming from all over to buy his produce, knowing the truth about the kind of man Jack Bennett was. Jack leaned back in his chair, a smile tugging at his lips as he thought about how far he'd come. Barbara had tried to tear him down, but in the end, he had stood tall not just for himself, but for the whole community. And as he watched the sun set over the fields, he knew that no matter what came next, he would always have the support of the people who mattered most. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack sat quietly on his porch, taking in the peaceful sight of his farm. The fields that had once been a source of stress and uncertainty now felt like a sanctuary. He had fought hard to protect it, not just for himself but for the community that depended on his work. What had started as a fight for survival had turned into a victory that went beyond the farm, one that brought people together. Barbara's departure had left a hole in the tension that had plagued the neighborhood. But Jack knew her apology wasn't the end. The community had seen what had happened, and they'd witnessed his quiet strength. The lesson wasn't just about standing up to a bully. It was about the power of honesty, kindness, and resilience. In the end, it was these qualities that had made all the difference. Looking out over the land, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had faced his fears, stood his ground, and come out stronger for it. More importantly, he knew he wasn't alone. The neighbors who once hesitated were now coming forward, offering support and standing up for what was right. Jack smiled, knowing this wasn't just about his farm anymore. It was about a community learning to stand together. And as he glanced back at the fields, he realized that, in some small way, he had inspired them to do just that.